Hello, students. Today we're going to read Bigger, Taller, Faster, Chapter 12 of Northern Lights. One thing I want you to take note of is look at the picture on page 174. The city itself, that's St. Paul, was the last navigable city, meaning last city, last area, last space that people could take a boat up the Mississippi River and land it. That's why St. Paul developed where it did. Minneapolis had the waterfalls, and that's why it developed where it did. But St. Paul's the last real boat city on the northern Mississippi River. All right, so page 175, we're going to read to about 180, talking about the growth of cities and some of the problems with urbanization. Urbanization means going from a rural or more country setting into a more city-like setting, okay? So, what to look for? Why did Nude Wellfald dislike the city so much? How did the people, buildings, and pace of the city change at this time? What differences were there between Minnesota's rural and urban areas? And how did people try to solve problems? Okay, page 175. In the early days of statehood, people thought of Minnesota as a land of farm and farmers. But at the end of 1800s, Minnesota was changing. Its cities were growing and growing fast. In a few cities, factories and mills grew. Their workers turned raw materials such as timber and grain into finished goods, such as furniture and flour. Each Minnesota city played an important, unique role in the state's development, but most dominant city was a rapidly expanding area known as Minneapolis and St. Paul, or the Twin Cities. The Twin Cities was a new term, reflected a new way of thinking. For years, people have thought St. Paul and Minneapolis as distinct cities. St. Paul was older and dignified, a center of business and politics. Minneapolis was younger, vibrant manufacturing center. Minneapolis had become the state's biggest city shortly after absorbing the town of St. Anthony in 1872. St. Paul and Minneapolis had always been rivals, but by the turn of the century, people in and out of the state had often thought of these two cities as a single metropolitan area. The Twin Cities and the other urban areas of Minnesota were very different from rural areas, from the farms and small towns of Minnesota. The cities were a jumble of contrasts. They were places of staggering wealth and extreme poverty. They promised exciting future, but also presented problems that sometimes seemed beyond anyone's ability to solve. Now, one of the things that I've always heard from some of my geography teachers when I was in college was that Minneapolis is really the first city in the West, and St. Paul is really the last city in the East. So older city of St. Paul, politically based, kind of older looking buildings. That's the last Eastern city, and then Minneapolis is the first Western city with its modern kind of upbeat tempo, manufacturing, youth-driven marketplace, and newer buildings and such. Noise, hum, and clutter on page 176. In January of 1913, a 44-year-old lumber owner named Nude Wayfald arrived in the big city of St. Paul. Wayfald had come all the way from Hawley, a small town of 800 near Moorhead in western Minnesota. His neighbors there had recently elected him to the Minnesota House of Representatives. Since the legislature did its work at the state capitol in St. Paul, is where he went. It didn't take long for Nude Wayfall to decide that he would much rather be in Hawley than in St. Paul. To him, the city was an overwhelming place that beat down the human spirit. He described his first impressions in a long letter to his hometown newspaper, the Clay County Herald. Here's what he said. The noise, hum, and clatter almost drives a person crazy to begin with. The hotel and rooming house air chokes me. The baker's bread poisoned me, and this is only looking against the high, dirty stone walls that makes a fellow stupid. It is a dreary contrast to the far-reaching view of snow-covered white and beautiful Clay County rolling prairie with its invigorating air. I cannot see how people can tie themselves down to live in a city, even with all the modern conveniences they have that we in the villages and the farm do not. Wayfald was not alone in his dislike of the city. For several decades, rural Minnesotans had to watch from a distance as cities grew in size and importance. Many especially resented the Twin Cities area. They suspected that the agricultural businesses headquartered there were swindling them. Like Wayfald, they considered the city a confining, suffocating place. But not everyone felt this way. To many Minnesotans, the city was an exciting place full of possibilities. Sure, life had its problems, but these were problems that could be fixed if they put their minds to them. Things were bigger, taller, and faster in the city, and many Minnesotans liked it that way. You can see a picture of kind of an early urban center at the top of page 177, and then you can see even cars and train tracks, or probably in St. Paul in 1914, on the intersection of 7th and Wabasha in the lower picture, and you can see that there's lots of crowds there too. A mass of people. One of the first things Nude Wallfeld noticed when he arrived in the cities was what he called the whole mass of people on the streets and sidewalks. Back in his hometown of Holly, people did not gather and move in crowds. There were not enough of them, but the city was different, as Wayfald described it. In his letter to the Herald, the people trudged through the city with no joy and pleasure to see any face. A stream of beings goes surging and seething up and down the narrow streets and out the doors of the dirty black and brown buildings. It reminds me of ants and ant heaps. And go to 178. You can notice on top of 178 there is a graph there that shows the relative population of the cities that are going there. So the bottom one blue is Duluth. You notice that Duluth steadily grows, but doesn't have a rapid rise like Minneapolis or St. Paul does at the very beginning of the graph. It just steadily kind of climbs. And there's information to be gathered from that, which is St. Paul and Minneapolis were having larger numbers of people move into them right away. Duluth just kind of slow and steadily grew. All right. Agree or disagree with him, Wayfald was right about at least one thing: cities were bursting with people. Minneapolis had grown beyond the most people's expectations. In 1880, Minneapolis's population was about 46,000. By 1890, it had jumped to 165,000. So that is about 120, almost 120,000 people jump in a 10-year period. The population reached 200,000 in 1900 and 301,000 in 1910. And Minneapolis was not alone. Other cities in the state experienced similar, although less dramatic growth. By 1920, more than 40% of the people in Minnesota lived in urban areas, up from about 15% in 1870. Many of those new urban dwellers came from farms and small towns in Minnesota. They were often young people who liked the excitement of the city and considered it a place of opportunity. Rural newspapers tried to stop the young people from leaving the country by painting an ugly picture of city life. They described the cities as places where swindlers and thieves infested grimy streets and dark alleys. Still, Minnesotans continued to move to the city. Immigrants also came to Minnesota cities. Many of these new arrivals came from countries that were unfamiliar to native-born Minnesotans. Until the 1890s, most immigration from the state was either from Northern and Western Europe. By the early 1900s, newcomers came from places like Italy, Greece, Poland, in Southern and Eastern Europe. The state's good farmland was already claimed, so most of these immigrants went to the cities or iron mines in northern Minnesota. In the cities, Immigrants took hard, low-paying jobs in mills and factories. Few understood English, and many of them could not read or write. They often lived with other people from the working class in areas like northeast Minneapolis, the west side of St. Paul, and West Duluth. They spoke their own languages and their own Minnesota-born neighbors. They often seemed slow in adopting American ways. African Americans migrated from other parts of the United States to the Twin Cities. They too faced prejudice and discrimination, so they formed their own neighborhoods and community institutions. All right, page 180. We're going to finish it off here, and then we'll stop at building boom, and we'll talk more about that later. As more and more people crammed into the cities, the problems of urban life increased. Swelling populations of workers competed for a limited number of low-paying jobs. Those who couldn't find steady work often watched their families slip into poverty. As poverty increased, crime increased, diseases such as diphtheria, tuberculosis spread in the city's tightly packed homes, apartments, and boarding houses. All these problems were worse in the cities than they were in the country. Still, many city dwellers enjoyed being part of such a large mass. They liked having so many different ways to spend their time. They liked being able to live their lives without being noticed by thousands of people around them. They could blend in the crowd. For those who had come from the small towns, this was something new. As Newt Walfeld put it, in a small town, people know what everybody else is doing. Walfeld thought that it was a good thing. Many city people disagreed. They preferred the anonymity to the big city provided. I think I'll get that word out. Anonymity to the big city provided. All right, thank you, class. That's ending it on 180. We'll start with building boom on page 180 next.